Hello and welcome to State of the Economy. Today we'll be talking to Thomas Richardson, Senior Resident Representative of the IMF based in New Delhi, pretty much covering whole of South Asia. Richardson will tell us about the global economic growth prospects in the light of the recent World Economic Outlook report which the IMF released in Washington a few weeks ago, and how the outlook would impact India, or whether India would be an outlier indeed among the emerging markets, producing a better growth story as people expect. On all these and much more, welcome to our show, Thomas Richardson. So, to begin with a framing question, the IMF in general has lowered growth prospects for the global economy. There's a bit of pessimism, especially for the US growth. There's a lot of pessimism for European growth as well as Japan. Also for emerging markets, there is not so much pessimism, but there is a sense that they won't grow to the potential in 2014. But India seems to be an outlier in that whole framework. Now, how do you read the conclusions of the World Economic Outlook for the world and for India?
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for having me on the show. Actually, we do this about 4 times a year. We put together a coordinated set of global forecasts where we look at growth and macroeconomic projections for all economies in the world, big and small. We do it, in October, January, April, and July. So our October numbers just came out, and as you say, we did reduce our growth forecasts for the globe, both for 2014 to about 3.3% and for 2015 to about 3.8%. So that does mean that we do see some pickup next year. It's not as if the world is all dark. We see things starting to recover, but we do see a somewhat less favorable outlook than we did, say, in July. And you're right that the biggest dark clouds on the horizon are for Europe, where we're worried about growth slowing down again, substantially. Even, because of deflation, we see some real risks to growth there. And also in Japan, where the Abenomics reform agenda
kind of stuttering now.
It looks like it's slowing down a little bit, particularly on the structural reform side, the third arrow, so to speak, where really, I think we are starting to look across the G20 space and see there's a lot of scope for structural reforms to get growth going. But those are politically tough everywhere you go, not only in India, but everywhere you go. So that's a challenge.
Same debate in India.
Yeah, same debate. But I think, it is true that the U.S. looks, a bit brighter. I mean, we had downgraded our growth forecast in July, and then we moved it back up again in October, partly because, growth seems to be, recovering, employment's, looking a bit better, fiscal deficit, all of the macro indicators look a bit better. Also in the UK a bit, things don't look too bad in the UK. Broadly speaking,
but Germany looks pretty bad. I read in various
softening a bit, softening a bit, and that's a challenge. I mean, of course, the Eurozone economies are all connected tightly. So when things start to slow down, across the Eurozone, it's got to have an impact on Germany as well. But, broadly speaking, I mean, I think over time we think growth will start to recover at the global level, and that'll help countries like India. India, as you say, I mean, is one of the bright spots among the emerging markets. In fact, if you look across
among BRICS particularly.
Among the BRICS, across the G20 countries, as a whole, the U.S. and India are really the two where we upgraded growth in the October WEO round. WEO meaning World Economic Outlook. And almost everybody else was downgraded, right? And some of them by quite a lot. Russia was downgraded quite a lot, given that, all of the uncertainty around the Ukraine conflict. And also, oil prices are being so soft. That has a big impact on Russia. Brazil has also slowed down substantially. China, we don't see slowing down quickly, but there is a rebalancing going on. And over time, we see, a shift away from investment-led growth toward, consumption-led growth, which we think will be a bit slower. There are some challenges in the financial system as well.
Is the risk in China real about property bubble-led recession? If this bubble even if it doesn't burst, if it shrinks dramatically, people are differentiating between a bubble bursting and shrinking.
Yeah, slowly.
So even if that happens, if it shrinks dramatically, do you think it'll impact growth in the emerging markets? Because a lot of economies are linked to China today, as they used to be with the US 2-3 decades ago, right?
And not just emerging markets. I mean, Australia is very tightly linked with Chinese growth, and so it has a big impact on many emerging market and some advanced economies as well. So yeah, China, a big slowdown in China, which we don't forecast, but if it were to happen, would have a big impact on growth globally, including in India. It would have some impact also on India. So. But we don't forecast that as a base case, right? We see some risk, in the financial sector. We think that the authorities at the PBOC actually and in government have a clear perception of the problem and are taking steps to address any vulnerability that's
But do you so you don't agree with the alarmist picture painted by people like Larry Summers who say that China may slow down to 5% or even 4% in the next 3-4 years.
Yeah, that's not our forecast. I mean, if it were to happen, it would have a bad impact on global growth, and of course, so we're worried about it. We would definitely. It's part of our job. We're paid to worry about what could go wrong, right? Yeah. That's kind of why the IMF exists. So we're looking for what could go wrong, but we don't see it happening as a high probability event. Broadly speaking, they have a lot of reserves. They have lots of levers to bring to bear to address vulnerabilities in the financial sector. And more broadly. So, we don't see a China slowdown as a major concern.
Tell me, coming back to India, given this backdrop, the global backdrop that you just spoke about and the IMF has outlined, what strategy do you think should India adopt while China is moving away from investment-led growth to consumption-led growth, right? Because they over-invested in the last 10-15 years, created huge capacities, infrastructure, etc. India, it seems, did not invest enough. So do you think time is ripe for India to power an investment-led growth, especially in infrastructure, etc., where we are substantially short of demand? Is that your
no question about
your reading?
There's no question about it. And actually, the slowdown in India, when India's growth slowed down from almost double-digit levels down to around 5% over the past couple of years. I mean, that slowdown started with a slowdown in investment. And we expect it'll turn around when the investment cycle turns, right? We think that as investment picks up, not only because there's a lot of demand for it, but we also think that there's, plenty of financing available, and we think that the room for infrastructure investment and more broadly, investment to pick up, that'll happen.
So capital is not a problem. Yeah. Financing is not a problem at all.
I don't think it's a major problem. Yeah, certainly, the
world is willing to finance.
The world is willing to finance India, particularly now that the current account deficits come off, right? So India looks relatively safe compared to other emerging markets. Current account deficit's sharply down. The deficit looks like it's coming under control, fiscal deficit, I mean. Yeah. Inflation is coming down.
Richardson, you said oil prices have come down in a secular manner, and analysts say that it's going to stay this way for a while. Now, India is obviously benefiting from this because India imports about 75-80% of its oil requirements. Now, how will this positively impact India's growth story? Is this part of what you just said as India being seen as one of the bigger growth stories in this whole region among the emerging markets?
Sure. That's actually one of the lucky breaks in a way. I mean, and the fact that oil prices have come off globally means that pressure on India's fiscal deficit comes off. Because India is a major consumer of fuel products, including in the budget. The current account deficit comes down. So
inflation comes down,
and inflation also comes down. So there are lots of positives as a result of that. And those are good reasons to kind of lock in some of those benefits for the future. So it should help across the board to promote growth in India. As you say, India is a major oil importer, a net oil importer. So it does have a big impact. But I also think that one of the positive things that the government did is this decontrol of diesel prices, because that's going to be very positive going forward.
Yeah. So do you see the risk that because oil prices have come down and fiscal deficit is correcting on its own, current account deficit is also correcting on its own, a sense of complacency might set in, which may prevent the government from taking other harder decisions towards structural reforms? Is that a risk?
Well, I wouldn't want to comment on, what the government's intentions are. I hope that they won't, would see this as an opportunity to kind of lock in gains and then move forward on other, structural reforms, things that could put India in a good position to promote growth over a longer horizon. Yeah. In the fiscal area, tax is one area, right? We think that the tax to GDP ratio in India is on the low side. Okay. That there's not quite enough revenue in the public sector to fund all of the things that government needs to do. And that's especially true at the union level, at the central level. Okay. And so we see there's lots of scope for enhancing revenue. I think GST will help, in the medium term to bring revenue up, and it'll also improve, the business climate across India, and it'll be a positive signal. I also think that tax administration reform is an important area to bring more people into the tax net, to, not necessarily raise tax rates, but to increase revenue by broadening the coverage of the tax system. That'll be very important. I mean, we saw China do this in the early part of the last decade. They raised revenue to GDP by 4 or 5% of GDP, and it put them in a much better position to weather volatility coming from outside. And I think India needs to do the same thing.
Okay. So oil prices, Richardson, have come down nearly 25% in the last 3 months. Mm-hmm. What is, say, IMF's projection for oil prices in the medium term, say in a 3-year term, the next 3 years? Because many analysts are now saying that the medium-term projection for oil prices would be well under $100. $90 to $95 is what Barclays research says. So do you concur with this view?
We do this. I mean, as I said, we put together a coordinated set of forecasts about 4 times a year. Our forecasts in October are on the web. They were a little bit higher than where maybe we might be right at the moment, because prices have come off a bit since then. Yeah. Whether we need to revisit them over the coming months is a question. I think, but clearly, if you look at oil price forecasting globally, it's a bit of a risky business. Yeah, yeah. A lot of
you have to track OPEC's behavior, right? At what point do they cut production, or how do they hold prices?
Exactly. There are factors that are difficult to predict. Yeah. I mean, looking down the road, I mean, I think the main thing to do if you're a policymaker is to make sure that you've built in buffers so that if something bad happens, right, something happens in the Middle East that causes oil prices to spike, or the Russia-Ukraine conflict causes oil prices to spike, that you're kind of prepared for that. And again, I mean, I think the decontrol of diesel prices for India is really positive. It will, so then oil prices and diesel prices could move with the market, and that would, make sure that you don't expose the budget deficit to, a lot of extra risk.
Okay. We'll take a small break here, and please don't go away and keep watching RSTV. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are talking to Dr. Thomas Richardson, Senior Resident Representative of the IMF in New Delhi. The World Economic Outlook also talks about, besides talking about the need to lift growth, it very crucially talks about the nature of growth that the world needs today. Because whether you look at the advanced economies or whether you look at some of the emerging economies, the one big worry is whether we are producing employment-intensive growth, right? And this is the biggest puzzle that India's policymakers are going through. The previous government produced 8.5% growth for 8-10 years, but it was accompanied by very low, subpar growth in employment, whether it's in manufacturing or in services. In services, it was low-grade employment. So how does the IMF research see this problem? How do you diagnose this problem?
Well, it's clear, we've actually been looking at this, over the past few years, thinking about issues like inequality and the composition of growth, where, ensuring that you have a jobs-abundant growth that, creates a lot of jobs, because clearly that, in the long run, is going to be more important. I mean, I think we've come to this not only for emerging market economies like India, but also for advanced economies in Europe and elsewhere, where, the growth that you've seen has often been, not been accompanied by job creation as much as we might like. So I think there are structural issues that need to be addressed, and they differ from country to country. Looking at India, I see lots of scope for labor market reform as a way of, broadening the formal sector of the labor force, bringing people into the formal sector of the labor force. I do worry about the number of people who are not protected by labor laws, right?
Yeah.
So you have labor laws that protect a relatively small fraction of the potential workforce.
Yeah.
And so finding some way to make it easier to hire and fire people while protecting their, fundamental rights, but ensuring that businesses actually can take decisions that allow them to grow to scale. I think that's really important. And so we're watching closely the reforms undertaken in Rajasthan. We'll watch closely across India as, other states perhaps take some experiments, some pilot projects to find ways of bringing people into the labor force. But that's clearly got to be a big part of the story going forward.
Tell me, Richardson, has IMF come across any other economy historically at the stage of development that India is in, and has had nearly 50% of the incremental employment coming in the self-employed space? Now, this is very peculiar to India. Nearly 50% of our employment is self-employment, is through they are self-employed. So it's you don't know what is the nature of their employment. They're obviously in the informal economy. Even small shops, village shops, where 2-3 members of a family sit in retail shops selling small stuff, that is also treated as employment. So have you seen any other economy going through this sort of structural problem?
India is unique. I mean, India is unique in lots of ways, right? So, I mean, I think we all recognize that. Clearly, the number of people in the informal sector in India is unusual for India's state of, level of per capita income. India is a middle-income country, lower middle-income country, growing rapidly, going to be a middle-income country, and then eventually, much wealthier economy. But only if you bring people into the formal sector. It can't be that you have this kind of income growth that extends across the 1.2 or 1.3 billion people, and they remain outside the ambit, not only
of formal employment. Here, Richardson, I want to ask you there's a very critical question here. I was reading The Economist, I think 2-3 issues ago, and they were looking at, there was a story on growth convergence, global growth convergence, and The Economist said that some of the advanced economies, which were, when they were at the peak of their manufacturing, they absorbed a certain labor force in manufacturing, say 30 years ago. And it says that today, if these emerging economies like India, at the peak of their manufacturing, will absorb probably half of that labor force because of advance in technology. So essentially what The Economist was arguing was that manufacturing cannot absorb the kind of employment that it did 30-40 years ago in the US or Europe.
Or China, right?
Or China.
Or China, 30 years ago, the growth in the 80s, it was...
So do we then conclude that manufacturing is not going to give you the kind of employment that you historically anticipate, and therefore you have to look at other avenues of employment? Is that a valid conclusion? I mean,
I think, the nature of manufacturing might shift over the next 20, 30 years, right? Information technology, lots of things. We don't know what kind of world we'll live in 20, 30 years from now, so it's hard to say. I do think that, looking across the developing and emerging market economy space, those countries that have had a lot of success in raising incomes and becoming, wealthier economies, much more, confident and healthier economies are ones that have actually had the manufacturing sector take off. And so
I'm not suggesting we must focus on manufacturing, but probably we cannot depend on manufacturing to absorb our labor force, 10 million that come into the Indian labor force year after year. Or therefore, I'm asking you whether do you think the solution lies elsewhere? I'll give you one example. For instance, yesterday, the chief of the global head of SoftBank from Japan, he met Prime Minister Mr. Modi, and he told him that that India probably needs an Alibaba type of experiment, which is a huge success in China, because he says Alibaba provides employment to 50 million people directly and indirectly, and it creates economic value add to the extent of $500 billion. It could even go up to $1 trillion if India creates which is in the digital space.
Sure.
And it's the service sector.
It's the service sector, for
exactly.
sure.
So therefore, I'm asking you whether do you think that employment will be absorbed not in manufacturing as traditionally seen in the 70s and 60s and 70s and 80s in the advanced economies? So something different needs to happen in today's technology-driven world.
Maybe at the global level, you could be right at a global level. I think India's advantage is that it has a relative wage advantage over some East Asian economies, where manufacturing is still taking place.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I think that, for India to have, if you have an Indian Alibaba or Flipkart or Amazon.in or whatever, they've got to have something to deliver. And they should be delivering stuff that's made in India.
Yeah,
right?
sure. Yeah,
I mean, that's crucial. So, if I were thinking about this, I would certainly expect to see the service sector continue to grow rapidly over time. I mean, India has a dearth of service economy outlets as well, it seems to me, at a kind of a higher level. But I think, fundamentally, the most unusual thing about India compared to other emerging market economies, particularly in Asia, is the absence of, fairly large-scale factories producing stuff. Things that are part of the global value chain, and that's a great opportunity, right?
You're right. India is not part of the global value chain on products like the Apple or some other high visibility global products.
Motherboards and things like that for for cell phones or for computers or for whatnot. I mean, all of that stuff could be manufactured here as well, since a big demand is here, right? So there's a reason from a location standpoint to put manufacturing in India, right? Yeah. India is a growing market for output, so you want to have manufacturing close to where you are going to sell it.
Yeah. So the initiative, the government's initiative on Make in India, which you might have seen, probably aims at creating more value add in India, or India becoming part of global value chain.
Absolutely, and I think I completely welcome the focus on improving India's ranking as a place for investment, a destination for investment, the doing business indicators, all those things. I mean, one can quibble about whether one indicator, World Bank indicator or World Economic Forum indicator, whether they're exactly done right. But for the most part, actually, I think they tell a similar story, that it's hard to do business in India. Yeah. It's hard to open a business. It's hard to get financing. It's hard to open a bank account. It's hard to get telephones. It's hard to close a business. And most businesses that open close, right? That's the life cycle of a business is that many businesses close. Bankruptcy is an important part of the whole process, and it's really hard to go out of business in India as well. So I think there are lots of things that government can do, and they seem to recognize that, which is great.
So. That's you raised a very interesting question. For instance, Apple computers, Apple products have China, Taiwan, Malaysia as part of the value chain. A lot of Apple value is added in these countries, maybe 10, 15, $20 billion. But India is not part of that story. So is that because Indian procedures, Indian tax laws, Indian tax procedures are still difficult to negotiate?
I think tax is difficult. I think the whole process of opening a business, importing things, all the whole chain of activities that take place when you're manufacturing, are more challenging here than they should be. And I think there's just scope to improve the ease of doing business. I've seen in other countries. I mean, if you look some smaller countries that have actually made a lot of headway in attracting investment by saying, look, we're going to make it really easy for you to set up shop, bring people in.
Like which countries?
Well, Georgia, for instance, in the former Soviet Union, was a very bad place to do business at one point, and they recognized that this was actually compromising their growth prospects. It took a completely radical strategy to just change the profile of the country as a place for doing business, and attracted a lot of investment over time.
And what about countries like Sri Lanka or South Asia, Nepal, that you also look after?
Well, Nepal has special challenges being landlocked, of course, and they also have power challenges that Bhutan, which I also cover, is starting to address by creating hydropower capacity in conjunction with India. And we would hope that eventually Nepal would address the same issues, because I think bringing they have such significant power shortages that they need to address them. Sri Lanka, I think, has made some headway in attracting investment, making it easier to do business. Bangladesh, obviously, the focus there has been on the textile sector.
Yeah, and they've done well in textiles.
But they've done well in textiles. And what you see in other parts of East Asia is that you can start fairly low on the value chain and move up, right? You can start with textiles, and 20 years later you can be making computers. Okay. And so India could actually follow that same path. No reason why not.
Okay. Thank you very much, Thomas Richardson, for talking to us. That's all we have in this edition of State of the Economy. We'll be back with you next week. Thanks for watching.